The egg did not hatch where it was supposed to. It had been laid deep in the forest on the eastern ridge, tucked into a warm rock cradle surrounded by other Vayak eggs, watched over by the clan's oldest nesting guard. But the night of the great storm, the ridge shook, mud poured down the slope in rivers, and one small egg rolled away from the rest. It slid through the dark and the rain for a long time. It came to rest at the bottom of the hill, half buried in wet leaves, well outside the forest edge. It hatched there, alone. The hatchling pushed the shell open with its nose, blinked in the cold grey morning and looked around. There were no other dragons, there was no warm rock, there was no nesting guard. There was only a field of frost-stiffened grass, a dirt road with deep cart tracks running through it, and at the far end of that road, a wooden fence surrounding a small farm. The hatchling was gold, not bright gold, more the color of old wheat, dry and warm. Its wing stubs were too small to do anything useful yet, and its legs were shaking from the cold. It stood very still for a moment, the way frightened things do when they are hopping no one will notice them. Then it sneezed. Then it started walking toward the fence, because the fence was the only thing nearby that looked solid. The farm belonged to Uldrich Vane. Uldrich was 63 years old, a widower, and a man of very few opinions about things that did not directly concern his crops, his fence posts, or the weather. He had come to Verath's Rest with his wife 30 years ago, built their home by hand, buried her in the garden 12 years back, and kept farming. He was not a complicated person. He did not have enemies. He had a reputation for giving extra grain to families who had a bad harvest, and for never asking to be paid back. He was in the barn feeding his 2 goats when the hatchling walked through the open barn door. He looked at it looked at him. It was about the size of a large cat, dripping with rainwater and mud, its small gold scales dull from cold. It looked at his bucket of grain, then back at him, with the specific expression that very small hungry creatures have when they are trying to decide if something is dangerous. Uldrich set the bucket down. He went into the farmhouse and came back with a boiled potato from last night's dinner. He set it on the floor. The hatchling ate the whole potato in approximately 4 seconds. Uldrich went back and got another one. He sat down on a hay bale and watched the hatchling eat, and the hatchling watched him back. After the second potato, it crept a little closer, still watching him. He did not move. It crept closer again, sniffed his boot, then curled up against the side of his leg, pressed its nose into the hay, and went to sleep. He sat there for a while, not sure what to do. He had never seen a Vayak dragon up close. Mostly they stayed in the forest. The colony had an agreement with them, a loose, unwritten thing that mostly meant humans stayed on their side of the ridge and dragons stayed on theirs. He supposed this particular dragon had not read the agreement. He got up carefully so as not to wake it, found an old wool blanket used for sick goats, and laid it over the hatchling. Then he went back to his morning work. Word reached him by afternoon that a Vayak egg had gone missing in the storm. A delegation from the colony council came to his farm 2 days later, nervous and talking very fast, saying they needed to return the creature before the Vayak elders came looking and created a political problem. 3 Vayak elders did arrive, tall, dark-scaled, formal, and stood at the edge of Uldrich's property and called for the hatchling to come. The hatchling was sitting in the barn doorway watching Uldrich repair a fence post. It heard the elders call. It turned its head toward them, considered, then turned back and watched Uldrich work. One elder called again, using what was apparently a formal command tone. The hatchling yawned. The council representative beside Uldrich whispered that this was extremely unusual. Uldrich nodded. He asked if anyone had thought to bring the hatchling something to eat. Everyone looked at him. He went inside and came back with 2 more boiled potatoes and set them on the ground. The hatchling ate them. The elders spoke among themselves in their own language for a long time. Finally, the eldest one looked at Uldrich with the expression of someone dealing with a problem that is not in any existing rulebook, and said, in careful Union common tongue, that they would return. He did not say when. They left. The hatchling looked at the empty road where they had been, then walked back into the barn and curled up in its corner on the goat blankets. The colonists started calling it Soru. It was their word for small trouble, not mean-spirited, affectionate, mostly. The kind of word you give something that has made itself at home in your life before you had a chance to decide whether to let it. Uldrich did not make a fuss about any of it. He was not the type. He built a slightly larger sleeping space in the corner of the barn, added more straw, and started setting aside an extra portion of his root vegetable stores. Winter was coming. The dragon needed to be warm. That was enough reason. Nobody taught Soru to work. Soru just started copying. It began small. Uldrich would carry water from the well in 2 heavy buckets, one in each hand, and one morning Soru picked up a bucket in its mouth and carried it alongside him. The bucket leaked a little from the bite marks, but it got to the barn. Uldrich did not make a big deal of it. He just nodded and kept walking. By the second year, Soru could carry a full load of firewood in both front legs and walk upright on the back too. By the third year, Soru was pulling fence posts out of frozen ground that would have taken Uldrich an hour to dig loose. Not with fire, Soru was careful with fire, almost shy about using it, but just with the steady, patient pulling that Uldrich had taught by doing it himself, slowly and without hurry, finding the angle that used less strength and more sense. This was what Uldrich taught, not in lessons, just in doing. He did not talk much. He was not that kind of man, but when he worked in a way that could be watched and learned from, and Soru watched everything. The way he measured twice before cutting, the way he checked the sky before deciding to plant, the way he left the corner of the field uncut at harvest, an old habit his wife had kept, food for whatever lived at the edges. Soru grew slowly, by Vaic standards, much too slowly. A Vaic scholar named Ovrin came from the eastern clans in the 4th year to make a study of the situation. He was polite about it, in the way someone is polite when they have already made up their mind. He spent 3 days observing and taking notes, and on the last day he told Uldrich, in a tone meant to be gentle, that the early imprint had likely stunted the hatchling's development. Soru would probably remain undersized, emotionally dependent, and unsuitable for clan life. He suggested Soru might be more comfortable in the care of the colonial welfare system. Uldrich listened to all of this. He thanked the scholar for coming, then he asked him if he wanted a meal before the road. The scholar declined and left. Uldrich went back to the barn. Soru was on the roof, patching a gap in the tiles with a flat piece of bark pressed down hard and sealed with one careful, controlled breath of heat. Precise, waterproof, better than what had been there before. "That Vaic man says I'm stunted," Soru said, not looking down. "He might be right," Uldrich said. A pause. "Does that bother you?" Uldrich looked up at the patch job. "Nope, patch looks good." Soru pressed the edge down a little more and said nothing. Over time, the settlers in Greyweld stopped being nervous around Soru. It happened the way most good things happen in small communities, not with a decision, but with accumulated small moments. The winter Soru found the Bellard family's missing goat 3 miles into the forest and carried it home unhurt. The morning Soru noticed smoke from the Tenor homestead before anyone else did and woke the whole Eastfield with a sound that could be heard across the valley. The way Soru stood at the edge of Uldrich's property when the union administrator came through, not growling, not threatening, just present, and the administrator looked at a gold dragon the size of a cart horse standing very still and chose to keep his dismissive remarks to himself. Soru was not big. Even full-grown, years later, Soru was smaller than any Vaic the elders would have been proud of, but Soru was steady. That was the Greyweld word for it, steady. What people noticed most was the building. Uldrich had taught Soru carpentry the same way he taught everything, by doing it while Soru watched. Measure, mark, cut, fit, test. A joint that holds is right. A joint that doesn't isn't, no ceremony about it. After a while, Soru began to build things independently, and people started noticing that Soru's work was exact in a way that was almost unsettling. The corners were perfect. The weight distribution was always thought through. A storage shed Soru built for the Bellard family in a single afternoon was still standing 40 years later, without a single replaced plank. Uldrich never said Soru had a gift. He would not have thought of it that way. He would have said Soru paid attention. He considered that enough of an explanation. The years moved the way years do on a working farm, season into season. The rhythm of it was something Soru came to love without naming it love, the reliable return of cold and warmth, the smell of turned earth, the particular silence of two beings working alongside each other without needing to fill the air with words. Uldrich aged. It was not sudden. It was the slow, daily way of it, a little more stiffness in the mornings, a longer rest at midday, the walk to the far field growing shorter as seasons passed. Soru did not speak of it, but Soru began to do things. Built a better ramp up to the barn entrance, the slope gentler now, fixed the bed frame without being asked, adding support rails, stacked the winter firewood closer to the door. Small adjustments, made quietly, finished before Uldrich noticed they had been done. And in the corner of the barn, beside the old goat blanket that had never been moved, Soru began setting aside flat stones and good timber, not for any current project, just keeping them, the way you keep things you know you will need. Uldrich noticed the pile once and did not ask about it. He was not that kind of man. The last night, Uldrich did not say anything unusual. He ate his supper. He sat in his chair by the window for a while and looked out at the dark field. He told Soru that the south fence would need checking before the ground froze. He went to bed. Soru curled up outside the farmhouse wall, which was the habit now. Soru had grown too large for the barn doorway years ago and too large for the house entirely, so the spot against the south wall, where the chimney warmth came through the stone, had become the place, close enough. It had always been enough. In the morning, Uldrich did not come out. Soru waited, then waited longer, then stood and looked through the window. He was still in the bed. He looked like someone asleep, except that people who are asleep have a particular quality of presence, a sense of being somewhere inside themselves. That quality was not there. Soru stood at the window for a long time. Petra Vane, Uldrich's niece, came by mid-morning with a jar of preserved fruit she had been meaning to drop off. She went inside. She came out again quickly, and her face had changed. She walked down the road to town without looking at Soru. She came back an hour later with 3 other people from the settlement. They went in and out. They spoke quietly. At one point one of them came and stood near Soru and said gently that Uldrich had passed in the night, and it would have been peaceful. There was no sign of struggle. He would not have suffered. Soru said nothing. Soru already knew. They buried him 3 days later in the garden beside his wife. The settlement came. There were maybe 60 people, which was almost everyone in Greyweld. They stood in the cold and said the human words for these things, and a few people cried, and someone had brought winter flowers and laid them over the turned earth. Soru sat at the back of the gathering, behind all the people. When it was over, the settlers moved away in small groups, talking softly, the way people do after funerals, going back toward warmth and food and the living. Petra stopped near Soru on her way past and put a hand briefly against Soru's shoulder. She did not say anything. She went home. Soru did not move. The light went grey and then dark. The wind came up. Soru sat in the garden beside the grave and did not move. In the morning, Petra came back, and Soru was still there. She tried carefully to explain that there was a space in the Bellard's larger barn. If Soru wanted, they had already offered, or Soru could of course stay at the farm. Nothing would change about that. Uldrich had no debts and had left the property to her in his papers, but she would not be moving in herself, and if Soru wanted to. Soru said, "I am going to build something here." Petra looked at the garden, then at Soru. "Here." Next to the grave, something small, with a window that faces east. She opened her mouth and then closed it again. She was a practical woman, which she had got from her uncle, and practical people know when a conversation has already ended. She nodded once. She said to come by the house if Soru needed anything. Soru started building the next morning. The stones from the barn corner came first. Soru had been setting them aside for 2 years, flat, good weight, the kind that fit together tightly without too much mortar. The timber had been seasoned the same way Uldrich had taught, cut, stacked with gaps for airflow, left alone until it was ready. Soru laid the foundation in a single day. It was small, room for one person to sit comfortably inside. A low door, one window on the east wall. 3 days to raise the walls. 2 more for the roof, pitched slightly, proper drainage, sealed at the ridge with the same heat breath technique Soru had used on Uldrich's barn all those years ago. A door that latched from inside. A simple latch, iron, fitted smooth so it would not stick in wet weather. The settlers watched from a distance. No one interfered. Some came by with food, which Soru accepted and ate between work. One morning the Bellard's eldest son Dovin came and stood nearby for a while, and then, without asking, picked up a spare plank and held it in place while Soru pinned it. He came back the next day and helped without speaking. Soru did not thank him because Uldrich had taught, by example, that work done alongside someone does not require a speech. When it was finished, Soru moved in. Not moved in the way people move houses. There was nothing to carry. Soru simply sat inside it, in the small space, with the east window open to the morning light, and stayed there. Petra came the first week, then the second. She brought food. She sat outside the shelter on a tree stump and talked about the settlement, about the south fence, about her plans for spring. Soru listened from inside and occasionally answered. A Union observation officer passed through Greyweld that winter doing routine settlement checks. He filed a report that read, Vaic juvenile displaying unusual territorial attachment to human burial site. No aggressive behavior observed. Classification unclear. No action recommended at this time. He had not known Uldrich. He had not known what the little farm looked like with the lights on in winter. He had not known the silence of 2 people working together without needing to explain why. He would not have known what to file that under. The first snow came on a Tuesday. It fell quietly, covering the garden, softening the edges of the mound above Uldrich's grave until it looked like just a gentle rise in the earth. Inside the shelter, Soru sat facing the window and watched the snow come down. The latch held, the roof did not leak, the east window let in the morning exactly as planned. Uldrich would have said, that's how you know the work was done right. Greyweld grew. Not fast, not the way cities grow with money and noise and a plan. It grew the way frontier settlements grow, one family at a time, one building at a time, the road getting a little more worn each year, a second row of houses going up behind the first. A school was built, then a proper well house, then a covered market that was used every 3rd day and used as a gathering hall on the other days. The farm at the edge of town, Uldrich's farm, became just another farm among several. Petra managed it for years, then her daughter ran after her. Soru remained in the shelter beside the grave. Not all the time, exactly. Soru helped when help was needed, carried timber, frightened off the large predators that came down from the ridge in bad winters, occasionally sat at the edge of building projects and made the one structural suggestion that saved everyone a week of work. But Soru always came back, every day, every night. The shelter was where Soru was. Children grew up visiting it. They were told by parents, older siblings, the general knowledge of the town, that Soru had lived there since before any of them were born, that the dragon had built the shelter with its own hands, that the grave inside the little stone garden wall was a man named Uldrich Vane who had been kind once and had not made a fuss about it. Some children were afraid at first, most weren't after the first visit. Soru spoke slowly, asked questions, and remembered the answers. If a child said her father's name once, Soru would use it correctly months later. This was noticed and appreciated. Petra's grandchildren called Soru by name without ceremony. Petra's great-grandchildren did the same. A girl named Aurea, Petra's great-niece, small, serious, with a notebook she carried everywhere, started coming to the shelter nearly every day when she was 9 years old. She sat on the stump outside and asked questions, a lot of questions. Soru answered most of them and told her honestly when something was not Soru's to answer. She asked once, "Do you get lonely?" Soru thought about it for a long moment. "Sometimes I miss having something to build." "You could build something." "I could, but everything that needs building, Uldrich showed me how to need. I do not have a list of my own." She wrote that down. She wrote most things down. By the time Aurea was grown, the political situation on Verath's Rest had changed. The Galactic Union had begun paying closer attention to the planet. There were resources in the deep forest that Union surveyors had been knotting for 20 years, and the Union was finally starting to have formal conversations about what to do with them. The Vayak clans had filed ancestral territory claims that covered most of the northern territory. The human settlements fell partly inside those claims. A Union mediator named Bren arrived in Greyweld, calm, careful, professionally neutral. He had files on the settlement's history, the Vayak claims, the resource assessments. He had files on most things. What he did not have was a file for Soru. He came to the shelter with Aurea, who by then was doing interspecies relations work at the Union Academy and had come home to document the situation. Bren stood at a respectful distance and explained the territorial question in even, reasonable tones. The northern zone, including the farm and the garden, fell inside the contested boundary. Soru listened until he was finished. "I understand the claim," Soru said. "The Vayak elders have rights to this land under Union heritage law. We are trying to find a resolution that—" "I understand the claim," Soru said again, still patient, still quiet. "I am not moving." Bren looked at Aurea. Aurea looked at a notebook. Bren tried a different angle. He noted that Soru was, technically, Vayak. Soru's own clan had territorial rights here. Soru could, in fact, remain on Vayak-claimed land even if the human settlement relocated. Soru said, "The humans are not relocating." "I cannot guarantee that." "No," Soru agreed, "you cannot." There was a silence. Bren was a professional. He filed the shelter as a complicating factor and moved on to other interviews, but the complication stayed. The Vayak elder sent to speak with Soru directly was named Harren, old, authoritative, with the deep formal markings of a clan leader on his scales. He stood outside the shelter in the way Vayak elders stand when they expect to be obeyed. He said the clan had been patient. The imprint was regrettable, but it had been 40 years. Soru's attachment to this human place was understood as grief, and grief had limits. It was time to come home. Soru said, very respectfully, "I am home." "This is a field," Harren said. "There is a grave in it." "Yes," Soru said, "that is why it is home." Harren called Soru broken, finally, when patience ran out. The word Vayak use for it meant something closer to misaligned, a thing that had grown the wrong direction and could not be corrected. Soru did not argue. Soru said, "He did not leave me when I was small and cold and lost. I will not leave him now." Harren left. He did not look back. Aurea stayed. She sat on the stump that had been there since before she was born, and she wrote in her notebook for a long time. Finally, she closed it and said, "He's going to make this very difficult at the Union level." "I know. Are you prepared for that?" Soru was quiet, looking at the grave. The stones of the shelter wall had weathered nicely. They had darkened to the color of old forest floor, settled into each other the way good stonework does. "I have been sitting here for 40 years, Soru said. "I believe I am prepared to sit here a little longer." The chamber of the Galactic Union Assembly was built to impress. It was enormous, a wide circle of tiered seats that rose high enough to make anyone standing at the center floor feel very small. 31 species sent delegates here. The walls were lined with the seals of member worlds. Everything was designed to communicate permanence, authority, the weight of law. Soru walked in and sat down and waited. It had been a long journey. Aurea's granddaughter Dale had arranged it. She was a legal advocate now, young and precise, and relentless in the way Aurea had been. She had spent 3 years building the case for Greyweld's protected status. Today was the hearing. She had called one witness. The chamber filled. Delegates settled. The session opened with the formal reading of the dispute, the Vayak ancestral claim, the human settlement's counterclaim, the Union's unresolved classification of the contested Northern Territory, and the attached anomaly notation, one Vayak individual, permanently resident on human-claimed land, complicating boundary resolution. Most of the early session was argument between legal representatives. The Vaic delegation presented their heritage documents, genuine, old, legally sound. Their lead advocate spoke well. He noted that the human settlement, barely 100 years old by Union reckoning, could not claim equivalence with thousands of years of Vaic ancestral connection. A Union delegate from the Seren species said, in a tone that was not quite rude but close, that human settlements on frontier worlds were historically temporary. They expanded until stopped or moved until displaced. This was not a judgment, he said. It was simply a pattern in the data. Another delegate said that the emotional case for the human settlement was understandable, but not a legal basis for overriding heritage claims. Dale waited through all of it. When they were done, she stood and said she had one witness to call. There was a brief procedural discussion. Witnesses in land dispute cases were unusual. The chamber allowed it. Soru was already there. Soru had been sitting at the center of the chamber floor this entire time, completely still, and several delegates admitted later they had not looked at Soru directly until Dale said the word witness. Something about how Soru sat, settled, unhurried, had made the ice slide past without alarm. Dale asked Soru one question. Will you tell this assembly what you know about Greyweld and the people who live there? Soru spoke for 7 minutes. Not loudly, the chamber had good acoustics, and Soru did not need volume. The voice was low, steady, with the careful packing of someone who has had 100 years to think about what matters. Soru described Uldrich Vane, not the man's accomplishments. He had not had many by any galactic standard. Soru described how he worked, the measuring twice, the leaving of the field corner for the animals at the edges, the way he built the barn ramp with a gentler slope without being asked, because a thing that serves its purpose well is better than a thing that only barely manages. Soru described Greyweld, not its size or its resource output or its legal standing. Soru described the winter when the Bellard family lost their harvest and the whole settlement divided what they had, and nobody wrote it down as a debt. The way Aurea had carried a notebook everywhere and written down things worth keeping. The way Dale, who was standing right there, had been brought to the shelter as a child and had sat on an old tree stump and asked 11 questions in a row without stopping for breath, and Soru had answered every one. Soru said, "You call humans temporary. I have watched them bury their dead with more care than I have seen any governing body honor its own treaties. I have watched them teach their children in the same fields where their grandparents fell, in the same way with the same words. They do not do this because a law requires it. They do it because that is who they are. You are calling that temporary. I am telling you that is what permanent looks like from the inside." The chamber was quiet in the way that large spaces get quiet when something has happened that no one was prepared for. The Vaic elder Harren, present as a delegate, said nothing. His expression did not change, but he did not look away. The Seren delegate, who had spoken about human patterns, said, after a long pause, that the witness's testimony was moving, but that sentiment was not a legal framework. Soru said, "I am not offering sentiment, I am offering evidence. I have watched one human family for 100 years. I have watched what they build, what they keep, what they return to, what they protect. If you cannot derive legal weight from 100 years of continuous testimony, then your framework has a problem I cannot solve for you." Another long silence. Dale spoke for the last time. She asked the assembly to consider a new classification, joint heritage status, requiring cooperation between Vaic and human communities rather than displacement of either. It had never been done. The Union had no template for it. She said that Soru had spent 100 years without a template and managed fine. The vote took 2 sessions over 2 days. It was not clean. Several delegates abstained. 2 species walked out at different points for procedural reasons and came back. When it finally passed, narrow, qualified, requiring a 10-year review period, it was noted in the Assembly record as the first joint heritage classification in Union history. Outside the chamber, Dale stood next to Soru and let out a long breath. "You were very calm in there," she said. I have been sitting beside a quiet grave for 100 years, Soru said. A large room full of arguing people is not so difficult after that. She laughed. The laugh echoed in the corridor outside the chamber in a way that seemed too light for a building that heavy. Soru thought Uldrich would have found the whole day very excessive. That seemed about right. The stump was the first thing to go. Not from neglect, someone replaced it. A flat-cut section of good timber, sanded smooth, with a small back support added because Dale's knees had been bothering her for years. The new stump was in exactly the same position as the old one. Soru noted the replacement, but said nothing. Good work did not require commentary. Greyweld was not a small settlement anymore. It had become a proper town with proper roads and a Union transit stop and 3 generations of families who had never known it as anything else. The Vaic community on the eastern ridge had grown as well, in their own way. Young Vaic came down to the settlement sometimes. Human children went up to the nesting grounds on school visits. It was not seamless. There were arguments every few years about boundaries and rights and resource use. Dale had spent most of her working life in those arguments. But the arguments happened, and then compromises happened, and then, slowly and without announcement, the thing that had been built became real. Soru watched all of it from the shelter beside the grave. Not always literally, Soru went where help was needed, same as always, but returning was the fixed point. Every morning, every evening, the east window with its morning light, the grave in the garden, the stone wall around it green with moss now, the name on the marker worn softer by rain and years, but still legible. Uldrich Vane, no dates, just the name. Soru had insisted on that when the settlement had wanted to put up something more formal. A name was enough. He had been a man who lived and was known and was missed. Dates would not add anything to that. The shelter had been repaired many times, always by someone from Uldrich's line, always in exactly the same style, the same flat stones, the same timber joints, the same pitched roof with the same heat-sealed ridge. The first time Petra's daughter Ren had shown up with stones and asked where to place them, Soru had been surprised. Ren had shrugged and said it seemed like the right thing to do. After that it became a kind of tradition, not formal, not scheduled. Just the thing that happened when something needed fixing. Dale came for her last long visit in autumn. She was old, not dramatically old, not the kind of old that fills a room with its weight, but the quiet old of someone who had done most of what they came to do and knew it. She sat on the smooth stump with the back support and did not bring a notebook. That was new. Aurea had always brought a notebook. Dale had too, for most of her life. Now she just sat. They were quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet Soru had always understood best. You never got tired of it, Dale said eventually, not a question, more like something she was confirming to herself. No, not even the hard winters, the years when the arguments got bad. Soru thought about it honestly. The winters are just winters, the arguments were important, I did not mind them. You minded Harren. I minded what Harren believed, not the same thing. Dale nodded slowly. He came around, eventually. Did you know that? Before he died, he made a formal statement to the clan council that the joint heritage ruling was correct, that he had been wrong. Soru had not known that. That was hard for him, he was a proud man. Do you forgive him? There was nothing to forgive, Soru said. He believed what he believed. Then he saw differently. That is what learning looks like. It is not always comfortable. Dale looked at the grave. The moss on the stone wall caught the low autumn sun and glowed a little, soft and green. What do you think he would say, Uldrich, if he could see all of it? Soru was quiet for a moment. He would say the south fence looked like it needed checking. Dale laughed, a real laugh, the kind that costs something when you are old and tired. It settled into the quiet afterward like it belonged there. She left before dark. She walked slowly down the road toward town without looking back, and Soru watched until the road bent, and she was gone. Soru sat in the shelter, with the east window latched against the autumn cold, and listened to the wind move through the garden. The grave was very still under its moss and its years. The little iron latch on the door held, same as it always had. In the morning, the sun came through the window exactly as planned. The seasons turned. Dale's children came, and their children after them, and the line of people who brought stones when the shelter needed repair continued without being asked or organized. Young Vaic from the eastern ridge started appearing sometimes, sitting near the shelter and watching Soru the way Soru had once watched Uldrich work. Soru answered their questions the same way Uldrich had answered questions, honestly and without ceremony. Decades passed, then more. A Union archivist doing a historical survey of Verath's rest wrote a brief entry on the shelter. She noted its unusual construction, its continuous habitation, its connection to the first human-Vaic joint heritage classification. At the end of her notes, she added one line, without quite knowing why it felt important. The shelter is still standing. The dragon, it is said, built it to last. She did not know, because she had not been there, that when Soru built it, Soru had not been thinking about history or politics or the Galactic Union or what anything would look like in 100 years. Soru had been thinking about a man who set down his work bucket, went inside, and came back with 2 boiled potatoes for something small and cold and lost, and had not made a fuss about it. That was all. That was enough.